Crimea has always been a prize, a coveted jewel glinting in the imagination of empires. Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Tartars, Ottomans, Russians have all fought for this narrow peninsula thrust into the Black Sea. Today, it's again a place of fire and fury, sirens wailing through the night, explosions shattering the stillness, smoke obliterating the horizon, holidaymakers barely evident. Recent weeks have seen an intensification of Ukrainian strikes against critical Russian military installations in Crimea, at Saki, at Belbek and beyond. These are not isolated attacks. They represent an attempt to dismantle the Russian control over the peninsula's airspace and strategic assets. Russia's celebrated air defences, the S-400s, even the experimental S-500s, have been exposed as brittle and overstretched. And in the face of these strikes, Russia's instinctive reaction has been telling. Authorities immediately closed the Kerch Bridge, the physical umbilicus binding Crimea to mainland Russia. Panic, not composure, now governs Moscow's strategic calculations. This moment, even when even senior Russian naval officials, officers, evacuate their families from Sevastopol under cover of darkness, reveals a simple truth. Russia's grip on Crimea is fragile and increasingly desperate. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, a new dissonance has emerged. It's been reported that President Trump, in his second administration, is preparing to propose recognizing Crimea as Russian territory, abandoning over a decade of formal American policy, reaffirmed by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's 2018 Crimea Declaration. The idea, however, that Ukraine might cede Crimea in exchange for a peace deal is not merely controversial, it is impossible, as I'm sure Zelensky made clear to Mr. Trump yesterday, legally, politically, morally, strategically. So let's look at the legal principle. The prohibition against the forcible acquisition of territory is a cornerstone of the post-1945 international order. If Russia's annexation were legitimized, the precedent would be catastrophic. Beijing might see a green light for Taiwan. Countless other border disputes could be inflamed. International law, already battered, would lose its vast vestige of authority. No credible Ukrainian government could ever accede to such a betrayal of sovereign integrity without annihilating its own moral legitimacy. Second, there's the political dimension. Ukrainian President Zelensky has been unequivocal. Crimea is Ukraine, and the constitutional words enshrine its inviolable territorial integrity. To accept the loss of Crimea would be political suicide, tantamount to national capitulation. It would fracture the Ukrainian system. It would demoralize its armed forces. It would embolden Russia to further aggression. Moreover, it would not be realism to accept Russia's fait accompli. Ukraine's sustained strikes in Crimea, despite limited naval and air power, demonstrate that Russia's hold on the peninsula is anything but inevitable. Crimea is not a frozen conflict, it's an active bleeding wound. Third, the strategic implications are profound. Crimea is not simply a symbolic prize, it's the keystone of Russia's Black Sea military power, home to the naval facilities at Sevastopol. If Crimea remains in Russian hands, Ukraine's southern flank and indeed NATO's southeastern frontier will remain under constant threat. To cede Crimea is to accept perpetual instability, perpetual war by another name. Fourth, there's the moral imperative. Since 2014, Russia has systematically repressed the indigenous Crimean Tatars, expelled Ukrainians, destroyed civil liberties, and engaged in large-scale militarization. Ceding Crimea would mean abandoning those communities to permanent subjugation. It would be, bluntly, a reward for ethnic cleansing and colonization. Fifth and lastly, the historical context. When the United States refused to recognize the Soviet annexation of the Baltic states in 1940, many at the time mocked the Wells Declaration as empty symbolism. Yet decades later, history has vindicated that stance. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia emerged from the wreckage of the USSR precisely because Western democracies refused to legitimize their occupation. The lesson is clear. Non-recognition matters. In the long arc of history, principle outlasts expediency. Now, it's true. Crimea poses immense challenges. Russia has fortified the peninsula. It has poured billions into integrating it. But Crimea is not and never will be definitively Russian. Ukrainian strikes, partisan movements, intelligent preparations, and civilian resistance attest to this enduring reality. There is, moreover, a profound risk in Trump's flirtation with recognition. Not only would it fracture Western unity, but it would also embolden authoritarian regimes worldwide. And the logic of might makes right has no natural limits. If Crimea can be taken by force, why not Taiwan? Why not Moldova's Transnistria? Why not yet more territory carved out of Ukraine itself? So even if tactical peace negotiations must occur, and they must, the cessation of Crimea must not and cannot form any part of any sustained settlement. To sell out Crimea is to sell out the principle of sovereign equality itself. In the end, peace cannot be secured through appeasement. It must be founded on justice, on the defence of the weak against the strong, on the defence of borders against aggression. And if history has taught us anything, it's this: territorial conquest may succeed for a season, but sovereignty, once betrayed, can only be redeemed by resilience and time. Ukraine knows this, and so in the words of Zelensky himself, there is nothing to discuss. Crimea is Ukraine.